The year was 1960. And in 1960, that's when the fat-free craze really began. We all know about 1980s diet culture. If you wanted to get fit and lose weight, you had to cut out fat from your diet. But what about sugar? Well, sugar was never mentioned because it was the war on fat. Remove fat from all food items, and that's how you created health food. Fast forward to today, in a way, this thinking really hasn't left us. If you look around and dig on the deep annals of the internet, you'll find that people say don't eat organ meat because there's saturated fat in it, and don't eat red meat because there's saturated fat in that, and definitely stay away from whole milk because there's saturated fat there. And if you're not a scientist, and if you're not deep within health and fitness and medicine, you may think that all saturated fat is the same, and that cannot be farther from the truth. And the question then leads us, is saturated fat really as bad as people say it is now and as people used to say it was back in 1960? Let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That. I hope you guys had a fantastic weekend, and I hope you guys are having a good Monday. So as you heard from the intro, today we're going to be talking about actually a very controversial topic, so get ready for that. We're going to be talking about saturated fat, as you heard from the intro. And spoiler alert, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lot of research that still needs to be conducted. So at the end of this episode, it's my hope that you guys walk away from this feeling like you're better able to pick out the fake information in the popular internet and popular culture, and even in the more air quotes trustworthy studies when it comes to this topic, because there is a lot of I want to say there's a lot of holdover data from the 1960s, from the 1970s out there about this topic. And the one other thing I want to say before starting this is I would like to invite you guys to go grab yourself a nice hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it if you want to bring out those autumn flavors. And also, before we're jumping into this, I'm not saying that saturated fat isn't bad. Everything in moderation. But we're going to actually get down to the science behind it and, of course, a little bit of the politics behind it. So stay tuned for that. So, like I always like to do, I like to find a research paper that takes the stance away from the positive. So in this case, I always like to find papers that say that there is that saturated fat is bad for you. And there's a lot out there, but the one I could find from a trustworthy source seems to say that there's no clear association between saturated fat intake relative to refined carbohydrates and the risk of insulin resistance and diabetes has been shown. And the effect of diet on a single biomarker is insufficient evidence to assess coronary heart disease risk. Furthermore, the effect of particular foods on coronary heart disease cannot be predicted solely by their content of total saturated fats, because individual saturated fats may have different cardiovascular effects, and major saturated fat food sources contain other constituents that could influence the coronary heart disease risk. Research is needed to clarify their role with specific forms, blah, 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 blah. And so this paper is titled The Role of Reducing Intakes of Saturated Fat in the Prevention of Cardiovascular Disease. Where does the evidence stand in 2010? And this is in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. So ultimately, after going through this paper, they seem to say that it looks like saturated fat may have some sort of effect on or reducing saturated fat has potentially some sort of effect on reducing coronary heart disease risk. But there's actually not that many studies that explicitly look at that. And so ultimately, they say while it may prevent or present a risk, we can't really be sure. For example, they say that individuals' saturated fatty acids have different physiological effects. Limited epidemiological evidence suggests that stearic acid is associated with coronary heart disease, but epidemiological data cannot distinguish C18 from other saturated fatty acids in terms of coronary heart disease risk. And so this is kind of a good segue into really the first part of our talk today, which is that not all saturated fats are the same. And I think that, if you're not in the sciences, if you're not in medicine or health and nutrition, it can become very confusing because it may seem like, the saturated fat in whole milk is the same as the saturated fat in a greasy hamburger from McDonald's, but that's not accurate. And for example, as this paper says here, in terms of cholesterol raising effects, stearic acid is neutral, whereas other saturated fatty acids, 12 carbon length, 14 carbon length, and 16, raise LDL and HDL cholesterol compared to carbohydrate. And it appears that carbon-14 has the strongest effects on LDL and HDL cholesterol. So that's a really good segue, I think, to start into the topic, because we need to define some things there. So what is LDL and HDL? Well, LDL is called low-density lipoprotein, and HDL is high-density lipoprotein. HDL, or high-density lipoprotein, is good cholesterol. And so when you're formulating, I guess, a heart healthy diet, you want to be looking for something that has high levels of good cholesterol and lower levels of bad cholesterol. However, LDL, or low density lipoprotein, there's not just one type of LDL. You have small dense LDL and large buoyant LDL. Large buoyant LDL is kind of neutral. And I say that because it is not easily metabolized by macrophages. And that's the primary mechanism by which a person develops a blood clot is macrophages come in and metabolize small, dense lipoprotein. And when that happens, the macrophages become converted into a mobile cell called a foam cell. And it's the overall accumulation of those foam cells and then other immune cells that go to that localized site that basically causes the atherosclerosis in your arteries, or the plaque formation. So that got me thinking, right? Because saturated fats do not actually produce low density lipoprotein or high density lipoprotein. They don't. The way that LDL is produced is from fructose. Yeah, I bet you didn't expect that this was going to lead into a famous Atticus rant about why sugar is the demon. But it's true. Saturated fats don't actually directly produce low density lipoprotein. Now, what do they do? Well, data, and this is from Open Heart in a journal in the British Medical Journal. So they say that what has been discovered in recent studies is that saturated fat increases LDL and HDL, yes, but what it increases specifically is LDL increases large buoyant, or a saturated fat increases large buoyant LDL and decreases small dense LDL. And so I say that and you guys are like, well, what does that mean? What that means is in patients who have coronary heart disease, most commonly the lipid profile is flipped. So we see that patients have much more SDLDL, or small dense LDL. They have high levels of that and low levels of large buoyant LDL. Because as I said, large buoyant LDL is not metabolized by macrophages, and so it really doesn't cause plaques that much. And the data is saying that saturated fat appears to decrease small dense LDL and increase large buoyant LDL, as a high concentration of small dense LDL and a low concentration of large buoyant LDL is associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease. Saturated fat may not necessarily increase the risk of coronary heart disease. And they're saying that because while saturated fat is increasing LDL levels, it's increasing large buoyant LDL and decreasing small dense LDL, which is it's inverse of what you see in coronary heart disease. And of course, it increases high density lipoprotein, which is good cholesterol. So now you may be wondering, I said that like 3 times. Why did I say that? Because it's very important. Because saturated fat as a whole increases total LDL, particularly lauric acid. So lauric acid is the primary saturated fat in butter. And lauric acid increases both small dense LDL, large buoyant LDL, but it also increases HDL, which is good cholesterol. And so the data seems to suggest that saturated fat in general cannot be assumed to increase your risk of coronary heart disease, because it doesn't look like it is increasing the triglyceride profile that is seen in patients with coronary heart disease. That being said, certain types of saturated fats like lauric acid do increase both very bad cholesterol, neutral cholesterol, and good cholesterol. Compared to unsaturated fatty acids, they have a less prominent effect for increasing high density lipoprotein, good cholesterol, compared to saturated fat. Thus, it is hard to determine the overall risk of consuming foods high in saturated fat versus omega-6 PUFA. So ultimately, what I take away from that is basically that cutting out all saturated fat and replacing it with unsaturated fat isn't necessarily healthier, because you're not going to be increasing your good cholesterol levels like you would be with saturated fat. And so here's where the debate comes in, because this paper was titled Effects of Dietary Fats on Blood Lipid Profiles, a Review of Direct Comparison Trials. And again, this was in the British Medical Journal, Open Heart. And so there's a lot of conflicting data out there, and there's a lot of it seems confusion out there about what is actually going on, about whether or not saturated fat is actually bad for you. And so what I'd like to do now is just briefly talk about how saturated fats actually increase LDL levels, because they do increase LDL levels. It's just they don't really all, except for lauric acid, they don't increase SDLDL, which is very bad cholesterol. So how do they do that? So basically, on hepatocytes or liver cells, where LDL is primarily both produced and metabolized, you have LDL receptors. And those LDL receptors, when they're bound to by LDL, in a way, it stops production of more LDL, but it also tries to stimulate the absorption of that LDL so it's out of blood. Data does show that saturated fats in general, they they interact with these receptors, and I'm very cautious to say bind because they're not inhibiting them. Data is showing that they interact with these receptors with LDL receptors on hepatocytes, which results in a lower efficiency at being able to remove LDL from blood, which results in an increase of LDL. But ladies and gentlemen, what I just said there means that they're not producing LDL. So they decrease the efficiency of your hepatocytes from being able to remove LDL from the blood. How do you think LDL is produced? And I'm going to give you a minute to think about this while I drink my coffee. LDL is produced by fructose. So fructose metabolism is extremely complex, and because I'm already at 16 minutes on this episode, it's extremely complex, so I'm not going to go through every step. I'll give you the abridged version. Fructose has its purpose in elite athletes or in somebody who's just run a mile-long marathon. Fructose can be very helpful because it is converted to glycogen at a very fast rate compared to glucose. Glycogen is very good. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose, and your muscles store glycogen, and they basically have a limitless storage supply of glycogen. And so, for all of my fellow gym rats out there, I think all of you guys will know that there's a point when you're in a workout where you can almost feel yourself going from, functioning fine to all of a sudden you're like, oh, yep, now I'm burning fat because you slow down, reps are harder. Why is that? That's because there's a certain point where your muscles have exhausted all of their glycogen stores. And for the runners out there or the people out there that do cardio in a fasted state, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So glycogen is very important because glycogen is the energy storage form of glucose that the muscles love to use for energy. So glycogen is great, and fructose can replenish glycogen stores almost immediately. But in people who have relatively full stores of glycogen, and I know I just said, oh, the storage of glycogen is limitless. Yes, but there is a point where consuming fructose will no longer convert that fructose, where the liver will no longer convert that fructose to glycogen if your storage of glycogen is sufficient in your muscles. So what happens? Well, a lot of that fructose will be converted will be converted to low density lipoprotein. And that's not good. So herein lies the question then. In the study that showed that saturated fat indirectly increases LDL levels because it reduces the efficiency of hepatocytes from being able to remove LDL levels. If you have a patient who doesn't eat sugar, are you going to see those same LDL level increases? And I don't know the answer to that. I honestly don't, because I don't think there's a lot of data out there, because I don't know how many people are like myself and cut out all sugar from their diet. But it is worth noting here that glucose can be converted into LDL, but that is under circumstances where, again, your glycogen stores are either maxed out or you're not expending enough energy to justify the metabolism of that glucose. And in that case, very small amounts would be converted into LDL. For example, if you eat 1 gram of glucose, maybe 0.1 grams of that will be converted into LDL, maybe. And so it's very small compared to fructose, where it's like almost over half of the fructose you consume will be converted into LDL. And in patients who are suffering from obesity, that number is higher because of a variety of other factors that have occurred because of fructose consumption, insulin resistance, etc. So ultimately then, try and go back to the original question, which was, is saturated fat as bad as it seems? And the data is suggesting that it might not be. Now, lauric acid is a different question entirely. Lauric acid raises SDLDL, large buoyant LDL, and HDL. So if you can minimize your intake of lauric acid and stick to other saturated fats, or replace that with other saturated fats, is it as bad as people seem to say it is? The data is mixed. The data is suggesting that it may not be. And Harvard School of Public Health seems to second me on that. The fact is, not all fats are bad, and concentrating too much on eliminating fat from our diets has in many cases led us to replace healthy fats with sugar. And that's the big thing. So I'm going to close out this episode today saying I hope you enjoyed it. And I'd like to summarize by saying this. You cannot just blatantly say saturated fats are bad. Lauric acid or butter may not be awesome for your health because it does increase SDLDL. But other fats, for example, whole milk. The fat profile of whole milk is 62% saturated, 30% monounsaturated, 4% polyunsaturated, and 4% other types. Now that 62% saturated, in my research, I couldn't find that it was that any of that was lauric acid. So there is data out there showing that whole milk may be good for your health as well, despite the fact that everybody seems to say it was bad for your health. For example, there's a paper that says, titled Whole Milk Consumption and Risk of Cardiovascular Disease and Mortality. The results were that there was no significance between daily intake of whole milk and increase with cardiovascular disease. There was no significance at all, but it was associated with a higher risk of all-cause mortality. But who knows what that means, because their data says that there was no association between daily intake of whole milk and cardiovascular disease risk. I have one more study here, if I can find it. Whole milk compared with reduced fat milk and childhood obesity, a systemic review. I'll spare you the long, boring methods. No offense to these researchers. This was, again, in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And what they determined was that, believe it or not, whole milk actually was seen with a reduced incidence of childhood obesity in the kids who consumed whole milk compared to the kids who did not, who consumed like skim milk or reduced fat milk. So what this is saying is basically that there is, in my opinion, overall, what we've determined is that there is a lot of information out there that present conclusions despite the fact that their data doesn't back it up. For example, in the first paper about whole milk I read to you, even though their results said daily intake of whole milk was not significantly associated with cardiovascular disease, their conclusions were less than daily intake of whole milk was associated with a statistically significant risk of cardiovascular disease. So that begs the question: why was there a risk of cardiovascular disease in people who did not consume whole milk daily, but in the people who did consume whole milk daily, there wasn't a risk of cardiovascular disease? But that question is never answered, and they don't even mention that part of their results in the conclusions, which made me sad. So, ladies and gentlemen, Is saturated fat bad for you? Well, compared to fructose, absolutely not. Lauric acid may not be awesome for you, but if you have butter and you have olive oil in your daily diet, the olive oil or the polyunsaturated fat may be reducing the effects of the increase in SD-LDL from the lauric acid. But other than lauric acid, it's looking like other saturated fats are not that bad for you. And that, in fact, we may not even be able to say at all that saturated fat consumption increases the risk for cardiovascular disease, as per the conclusions of the British medical journal Open Heart study that we talked about towards the beginning. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Remember, avoid fructose at all costs. Unless you put a little bit of maple syrup in your coffee, that's fine. But do whatever you can to avoid fructose, because fructose is honestly, that is the real cause of heart disease. That is the biggest factor in heart disease. And if anybody out there is listening to that and gets angry at that, fine. But you can look up the data and you can see that fructose is not only the leading cause for cardiovascular disease, but also for obesity and insulin resistance and diabetes, or adult diabetes, on and on and on. So saturated fat may not be as bad for you as we think. Everything in moderation. And the data is looking like whole milk may be good for your health, at least for kids, along with all the calcium you get from whole milk. And don't stop eating organ meat just because it has saturated fat in it, because yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you guys all on Friday. And remember, until then, stand up and question everything.